Hello everybody, weegee here, and welcome to my review of the final of the early released episodes of Ice Queendom, which is episode 3. Not much to say here, so let's get started. The third episode of Ice Queendom starts with Team RWBY decorating their room, before they have to book it to class or be late. This class being Professor Port's, where Weiss is annoyed with Ruby's immature actions and volunteers to fight a Grimm to prove how good she is. Honestly, the reasoning of both this one and the original went over my head. After the fight with the Grimm, we get a fight between Ruby and Weiss about her being team leader, before their respective talks with Osmond and Port. While wandering around lost in thought, Weiss happens upon Jean and Pyrrha talking, on the roof, where Pyrrha awakens Jean's aura. Weiss sees this, and the lesson she takes away from the fact that Pyrrha unquestionably accepts Jean as her leader is that maybe you can get more points of being a good teammate to a poor leader. After this, we get a scene from the original where Weiss makes Ruby some coffee and declares she is going to be the best teammate she can be. Then, we get our first look at the new Grimm in action, as it has infected Jean, trapping him in a nightmare built upon his own insecurities. Our new character, Xion, sends his team into his nightmare to help him. Team Juniper defeats the Grimm and Xion seals it in a container, where it takes the appearance of a bad banana. From here, we go back to Team RWBY, who are going into town for the upcoming festival. On this trip, they happen upon a dust robbery, and Weiss and Blake get into a small argument about the White Fang. Before it can escalate, though, Sun runs by them, having stowed away and is now on the run from the police. Weiss suggests they follow him to prove her point. During their chase, Weiss crashes into Penny. They talk a bit before Blake and Weiss get into it again, about the White Fang, and the Faunus. This time nothing interrupts them, and Blake reveals that, well, she's a Faunus. Then she runs away. From here it flashes between stuff we saw in the original show with Blake and Sun and Penny and Ruby, before mainly focusing on what Weiss and Yang are doing during the whole ending of Volume 1. During this conversation they hear about a dust robbery, and make their way to the docks, where we catch the ending of the fight with Torchwick. Weiss decides she doesn't care that Blake is a Faunus. One more important note before I talk about the final scene: throughout this episode, Weiss occasionally sees a copy of herself. At the end of this episode, Weiss is standing in her dorm, before the other Weiss once again appears, telling Weiss that she is lying to herself if she thinks she can forgive the White Fang and the Faunus that easily, and that she is burying her dreams. Then we see the vines from the Grimm surround Weiss, and the episode ends with Weiss floating encased by the Grimm. So I'm going to be doing something a bit different this time. Instead of a review followed by analysis, I'm just going to combine them and give my review while taking a look at the scene. The first scene I want to talk about is actually a fight scene. This time it wasn't even on purpose. This fight happens after Weiss gets flustered that Ruby isn't taking class seriously, instead sleeping through it, and decides to volunteer to fight at Borbatusk. While a very brief fight, this fight scene is beautiful and brutal. I love the way Weiss's rapier gleams while she uses it, and the trailing blue lights they use to accentuate both her semblance and her movement are just perfect. The finish is pretty brutal as well, with black blood splurting out as she drags the Grimm across the ground a bit before switching her grip to get that final push to kill it. That was a pretty cool detail. Right after this scene, we get the fight between Ruby and Weiss. The fight itself is almost the exact same as the show. Weiss insults Ruby's qualification to be team leader before they split up and have their respective talks. There are a few changes here that I really liked. One is the inclusion of Blake and Yang in this scene. Just like the scene on the airship, I felt like this makes them feel more like a team, with them being more involved with everything. And Blake telling Yang to let Ruby handle herself was a good addition. That fills in some of the blanks, as in the original it didn't make much sense as to why Yang didn't step in while her sister was being insulted. Here they give a reason, which is cool. The second thing I liked here is Ruby's response. She also doesn't understand why she was made leader, and she shows doubt in some of her abilities. This scene, like the one with her mother's grave, makes Ruby seem more human, with her own doubts about her abilities, and said ability to be the leader Team RWBY needs, as well as doubting her early acceptance into Beacon. I think this show does a good job of balancing Ruby's upbeat attitude while showing that despite her optimistic personality, she does have her own insecurities. For my final point on this scene, we'll be switching over to Weiss's conversation with Port. While overall this scene is basically the same, there is one minor change to the dialogue that, while it seems small, is a pretty good detail. It's Weiss's response to Port. In the original, she follows the line "that's not remotely true" with, well, not entirely. In this, she just says that's not true at all. Which, with what we know about her childhood now, is entirely true. Her home life sucked. She probably didn't get anything that she wanted, just things that her father deemed necessary to be the perfect Schnee. Before we move on, there's actually one thing I want to talk about that happens before this fight, which is the Weiss seeing this other Weiss for the first time. This is an excellent setup for what is to come that shows us Weiss's inner conflict. as she only shows up as Weiss is having conflicting emotions on things. From here, let's move on to a scene that I have some really mixed feelings on, which is the Weiss eavesdropping on Jean and Pyrrha scene. This scene takes Weiss's biggest character development scene from Volume 1 and twists it on its head. In this, Weiss is only nice to RWBY because she believes that supporting an incompetent leader will earn her more points. Unlike in the original where she did it because Fort's words kinda gave her a wake-up call. While I don't think Weiss is being totally disingenuous here, as she does tell RWBY that she always wanted bunk beds as a kid, but for the most part, Weiss is putting on this act of being nice to RWBY because she thinks it will put her one step closer to being perfect. This scene is another case of me understanding what they're doing, but being a little frustrated that they are taking all of Weiss's good moments and twisting them. I'll talk more about my thoughts on this version of Weiss at the end, as there are a couple more changes to Weiss in this episode. Let's move on to the next scene, which is our first glimpse at what the new Grimm can do. After the awakening of Jean's aura, the Grimm grows rapidly, spreading across Jean's body. When the rest of Team Juniper wake up, they see these vines across Jean. This is where our new character comes back in. It turns out that Xion hunts these Grimm called nightmares. The nightmare Grimm attaches itself to a person and grows by draining their aura. Once grown enough, it traps the host in a dream created by their weakness and insecurities, making the host a breeding ground for Grimm. The only way to kill this Grimm is by sending close friends of the person into the dream to kill the Grimm inside. I love this idea, as I love any Grimm that relies more on a special ability rather than its physical strength. Grimm like the apathy and the chill are infinitely more terrifying to me than Beowulf and Ursa. It's easy to defend yourself from something physical, but how do you fight something that attacks your mind? Or in this case, a Grimm that attacks your self-doubts and insecurities. The way they deal with it is super cool as well, as it lends itself to character development and exploration, with you having to send your friends to deal with these insecurities. It could also be a creative way to explore the backstories of the characters, as most insecurities come from your past experiences. With what happens at the end of the episode, we might finally learn more about Weiss's childhood, and just maybe we will learn what happened to her grandfather, and why Weiss and only Weiss has a problem with White Fang amongst the children at least. Whitley never said anything racist, right? Going back to the scene itself, I love that they use a dream catcher as Shion's weapon to fight the Grimm. Also, the little dolls of each of the characters are really cute. Inside the dream world itself, I love that Pumpkin Pete is on all of the weapons, and the background knights as well. John is probably a little insecure about his love of the mascot. On a more serious note, though, I like how the focus of the ridicule his weapons are throwing at him are about the legacy of the Ark family. As while we didn't see it in this version, people who have seen the original will know that Jean's biggest point of self-doubt is his inability to live up to his family name. The fact that his sword is amongst the things surrounding him hammers at home, as it is more of a family heirloom than anything else. On to the next scene, which is Team RWBY's adventure to the docks, where they happen upon a desk robbery and are introduced to Penny and Sun. The first thing we're going to be looking at is Weiss's reason for following after Sun. In Ice Queendom, she wants to follow after Sun because she wants to prove to Blake that all violence are evil, which is a lot more racist than the original reason, which was to observe him as an opposing student. This is a good change as it helps push the conflict between Blake and Weiss. Her treatment of Sun is the breaking point for their tension. But before we can get to that moment, let's talk about Penny, because I love the way they presented Penny in this. There's a certain stiffness to her movements that is just perfect, as well as a robotic feel to her facial expressions. She's so cute, and it's nice to see her again, because, spoiler alert, she kind of died at the end of Volume 8. Now let's get to the fight between Blake and Weiss. Well, the gist of this fight is the same, with Blake calling Weiss a racist, essentially. There are a few lines that I want to focus on, as that's the only thing that's changed aside from them never going back to the dorms. The first one being Weiss's response when Blake calls her ignorant. While I loved the lines in the original, there is just something more raw about the lines here. Especially the line, "Have you ever attended any of the funerals of the people they killed?" That line is so good. It, along with the lines follow, help establish Weiss's internal logic for her thoughts on the White Fang and Faunus. There's also something more personal about this scene here, compared to the original. The line, "Do you know how much they've made me suffer?" makes it feel like it has impacted her on a more personal level, and not just that her father's anger affected her childhood like in the original. Like maybe one of those funerals she had to attend was someone she knew and loved. Another scene later alludes to this possibility as well. There's a line both in this version and the original that has always bothered me. It doesn't have any impact on my opinion of the show, but this is the perfect time to talk about it. It's a line that never made sense to me. In this scene, Blake says there's no such thing as pure evil. This line has always confused me, as aren't the Grimm creatures of pure evil? They act only on negative emotions and exist only to kill people. It's a line I'm honestly surprised they kept in here. Regardless, I love this scene, and I love the way that this show built up the tension between the two, with the other characters usually intervening before it can get too bad, until it reaches boiling point, and all they could do is watch it explode. They also added a bit to the end of this scene, with Yang getting into it with Weiss about what she said, which is a great addition. It was always weird that Yang kinda just sat back while Weiss was being racist. This scene was done better than the original, in my opinion. There's really only a couple more scenes I want to look at, as from here it flashes between stuff we've already seen and a couple of new scenes. Like in this, we get to see what Yang and Weiss were doing during the whole time. Turns out they were just talking. This is a great scene, as I've always been interested in what exactly they were doing, but it also has some good character moments. This is when we see Weiss's shell start to crack, and we see why exactly she's been acting the way she has, aside from the fondness thing. Nothing has turned out the way she has imagined it would. She finally escapes from her father, only for things that beacon not to go her way. Her dreams have been shattered, so she reacts the only way she knows how to, which is acting like she is better than everybody else. The fondness line at the end, though, is a bit much. Before we continue to the rest of this interaction, I think this is a good place to talk about the changes they made to Weiss, as this is kind of the end of them. I've been saying I understand why they made the changes that they did, so I'll start with that. I said before that in the original show, Weiss's racism comes out of nowhere and disappears just as quick. The same be said for Chase for Perfection. In this, it is consistent throughout the first 3 episodes. This both sets up conflicts to come well, and will contribute to a more complete character arc for Weiss. Something we'll probably see more of, as after her capture with the Grimm, we'll likely have to see her come to terms with both her insecurities and her discrimination for the fondness. Honestly, my only problem with this is, as a fan of Weiss, it's a bit hard to watch Weiss get progressively worse as the episodes go on, and for her good moments to either be erased or twisted, even if it's better for the overall story. After Weiss's mini breakdown, Weiss and Yang have some back and forth about RWBY that I liked. Yang asks Weiss how long she is going to brag about being the perfect teammate and start being a good friend. This is a good scene for Yang, a character that some of the community plays as a little dumb. It shows that she is quite observant. Then there's Weiss's line of RWBY's need to show off comes from Yang spoiling her, which is just as good for Yang's character, as it shows that Yang might be a tad bit too overbearing, which isn't good for RWBY, but it shows Yang has some flaws, outside of I'm too angry. Let's jump to the final scene now. We'll skip over the Weiss mix up with Blake stuff because that's all the same. Instead, we'll focus on the final scene. Weiss returns to the dorm alone, where the other Weiss shows up, once again, commenting that Weiss is burying her dreams and that she would never be able to forgive the White Fang before she is ensnared by the Nightmare Grimm. I haven't talked much about the sound design for this show, but I want to mention it here. The way that the music dead stops right as the Grimm talks is great. The most interesting thing about this scene is the line that the Grimm tells the Weiss, that she would never be able to forgive the White Fang. Earlier I'd mentioned that Weiss's dialogue hinted at a more personal hate, and I think that this further pushes that idea, as why else would that be one of the main things that the Grimm is focusing on? This Grimm exploits a person's weakness and focuses on personal things, as we saw with Jean, when the Grimm focused on his insecurities about being unable to live up to the arc name. So the focus this Grimm puts on the White Fang has to be something more personal to Weiss, as well as the focus on Weiss's burying of her dreams, something she has had to do her entire life. Now let's talk about where I think the show is going to go from here. Honestly, there are only 2 directions this could go. Either next episode, we are going to see the rest of Team RWBY enter Weiss's mind, and this is where that Through the Looking Glass world is going to come in, with the members taking on their alternate designs. And the only reason I think this might happen is based on a post by someone at Rooster Teeth. Before she is fully captured, one of her teammates, probably RWBY, will snap her out of it, and the possession will be postponed until the end of Volume 2. Again, the only reason I say this is a possibility is because there was a post by somebody at Rooster Teeth that said the first episodes would recap the first 2 volumes, and we've only seen Volume 1. He might have misspoken or lied on purpose, but we will see when Episode 4 comes out. Overall, I think the episode was really good. It followed through on all the setup for the conflict between Weiss and Blank very well. The pacing was a bit rough, with them skipping over quite a few things, but I feel like that comes from them wanting to focus on Weiss and not Blake and Sun. This episode makes it very clear that this is a companion piece to the original show, not a complete remake. The one action scene in this episode was short, but stunning, and the character interactions were really well done, and helped expand the characters. My only real issue is the same one I had with the second episode, which is the need to have prior knowledge of RWBY to enjoy the show to its full extent. So yeah, it was a really good episode. An 8 out of 10. So if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts on the episode in the comments below. Weegee out.